Hello and good evening and bonsoir. It's nice to have you all here today, and I welcome you on behalf of Columbia University. My name is Wafa El Sadr, and I'm the Executive Vice President for Columbia Global and a Professor of Medicine and Public Health at Columbia University. I want to start first by welcoming our distinguished guests, President Director Descartes, welcome, and of course, Professor Bachir Diagne, and also colleagues and friends who are joining us today for this very exciting evening conversation. I'm of course particularly delighted to welcome our partners from the Louvre Museum, the Columbia faculty who've been able, and leadership who've been able to join us, members of the Reid Hall community, and especially want to welcome, where's Paul, Leclerc, and Judith Ginsburg. Welcome. And I think we, as many of you know, that this week we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of Reid Hall since it became part of Columbia University. So we're very honored to work hard to preserve the legacy of Reid Hall. And yesterday we had a great opportunity to listen to an amazing story of this center here, this amazing focus of culture and scholarship that has been part and parcel of Reid Hall and for the past 60 years. I think tonight's conversation could not be more fitting, having two remarkable thought leaders. We have with us today the first woman to lead the Louvre in its 230-year history. That's rather remarkable. Congratulations. As well as, of course, one of Columbia's most distinguished professors and philosophers, Professor Bachir. Welcome for joining us today. And this event truly exemplifies what we at Columbia Global believe very strongly and aim for, which is to bring together diverse perspectives and try to grapple with some of the most difficult issues that we face today as a global community. So the question for today's discussion is very important, and I think speaks directly to the role of cultural institutions that they play in an interconnected world. So I'm looking forward to the conversation that will be moderated tonight by you, András. Actually, by the way, I need to tell you all that this is a Columbia alumni, right, who graduated in 1995 with a PhD in sociology. So it's truly a Columbia event tonight. I think I always reflect whenever we're in this beautiful hall, we call it the Grand Hall, Ginsburg-Leclerc, we're celebrating, I think, something far deeper than just this beautiful space. And we're celebrating the role that the Paris Center and Reid Hall plays as a vital hub for Columbia's engagement with the world, and particularly connecting with Paris and with France and also with Europe beyond. So I look forward to the insights that we will gain tonight from our distinguished speakers. Thank you for being here with us at this historic moment in the history of Reid Hall, and also at a moment when we're having this amazing evolution of it as a center for global dialogue and understanding. So thank you very much for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to the eminent director of Reid Hall and the Global Center here in Paris, who has been at the center here for 40 years. I have to remind her of this again. But she has been an amazing force really a true force of nature. Brune is a force of nature, as many of you will agree. She is a force of nature, and she's so committed. She is so committed to the mission, and is working day and night to continue to advance our collective mission and vision. So welcome, Brune, to this lectern. Thank you.
So I paid Wafa to say all those nice words for me, except for the fact that I was here for 40 years. Okay. So tonight is a really special night because it's the inaugural edition of the Judith Ginsburg Annual Program in Arts and Culture. So Judith and her husband, Paul Leclerc, have been an integral part of Reid Hall for the past 12 years, and their engagement and philanthropy during that time constitutes a key chapter in Reid Hall's history. We owe the creation of this endowed annual Judith Ginsburg program to the generous initiative of Judith's nephew, Raphael Ginsburg, and his wife, Emily Coward, and Judith's niece, Sis Claire Megathlin and Alicia Ginsburg. Thank you over here. For this superb new addition to our public programming in honor of Judith. Judith, I'd like for you to stand up, please, if you can. Please. It really is a truly meaningful gesture for us here at Reid Hall. So thank you to the entire family. At the same time, I would especially like to thank both Judith and Paul Leclerc for funding the renovation of this very room, the Grande Salle Ginsburg-Leclerc, an extraordinary gift that has had a profounding and lasting impact on our endeavors. As you can see, it's a beautiful, beautiful room. And Paul regrets that he could not join us tonight, but his commitment to increasing Columbia University's visibility in France remains as strong as ever. His continued efforts ensure that this historic space thrives as both a physical and intellectual landmark. I also wish to acknowledge Columbia University's former Vice President, Jerry Rosberg, and his wife, Laura, whose gift has also been equally vital to the transformation of this room. Thank you so much. Okay. Now let us recognize the unparalleled significance of this occasion. Even before Helen Rogers Reid gifted this property in 1964 to Columbia University, 4 Rue de Chevreuse had been at the center of innovation, intercultural cooperation, and educational exchange. Tonight, we celebrate a new chapter in its history, marked by a shared vision for its future. Each of you have ensured that Reid Hall continues to inspire, connect, and evolve. So I would also like to extend a warm welcome to our speakers who have already been introduced. Thank you for being with us tonight. We really appreciate and hope that the discussion will inspire everyone. So without further ado, I'm going to present our dear Séverine Martin, who is the head of the undergraduate programs and who also leads our public programming here at Reid Hall. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Hope you have a good evening.
Thank you, Brune. I'm going to start by sharing a little secret, because Brune was previously introduced as the director of Reid Hall and the Columbia Global Center Paris, but you might as well know that we love Brune so much that we sometimes affectionately refer to Reid Hall as Brune Hall. So I'm known for a certain joie de vivre, but the joie de vivre is with us all here tonight because, and it is in that spirit that I welcome you all, especially as tonight is an evening of celebration, a celebration of our esteemed donors, of Reid Hall's exceptional journey over the past 60 years, and arts and culture in a global context, and all that celebrated in the company of some of our greatest institutional partners. To all of you who are our friends and supporters, thank you for being here. My thanks would not be complete, however, without acknowledging an exceptional group of people who worked very hard to be here this evening and who have been preparing this encounter over the past 2 months. These are the brilliant students of the Louvre Masterclass, composed of students from the École du Louvre, undergraduates from the Columbia and Paris program, graduate students from the Masters in History and Literature program, and fellows from the Institute for Ideas and Imagination. Our wonderful students have been exploring the concept of the Universal Museum, a question at the heart of Bachir Diagne's residency as the Chaire du Louvre this year, and a question that will guide a part of this evening's conversation on reimagining the museum's legacy as a universal model in a 21st century context. Without further ado, I will pass the mic to this evening's moderator, András Szántó, who, voilà, as you understood, belongs as much to the art world as to Columbia University. Wafa, you mentioned that, voilà, András completed his PhD in sociology in 1995, but voilà, I will add that he worked under the mentorship of philosopher Arthur Danto, whose drawing happens to adorn the entrance of the Grande Salle Ginsburg-Leclerc. András is now one of the world's leading advisors to cultural institutions, running several museum leadership programs, such as the Global Museum Leaders Colloquium at the Metropolitan, and more recently, the Museums of Tomorrow Roundtable. He is also a widely published author whose writings have appeared in the New York Times, Art Forum, the Art newspaper, among other publications. During COVID, he published 2 acclaimed books, The Future of the Museum, featuring 28 dialogues with museum directors from around the world, and Imagining the Future Museum through 21 dialogues with architects. Please join me now in welcoming András this evening.
Thank you. And maybe we can have that beautiful piano music back a little bit so we can. Well, thank you all. I think it's wonderful of you to mention Arthur Danto. Some of you here might have known him, certainly have read him. Paris was incredibly important to Arthur. He spent many, many summers, I think whole sabbaticals here, and just very attached to this place. I should also say that the very idea of this center being committed to the idea of globalism is something that we should all celebrate. Our conversation is happening in what are, shall we say, interesting times. Thank you also for all the organizers and the wonderful introductions and all the things we have to thank in this moment. So I managed to lose the first page of my notes, but that's okay. I will improvise a little bit. And beginning with the fact that for museums, we are living in a moment where arguably more change has happened in the last 10 years than in the previous 50 years. It's also an unusual time for museums because museums are questioned profoundly as never before. And I think that that questioning on the one hand is a little bit disorienting and difficult, but it also is somehow oddly liberating because it allows us to ask new questions and explore new possibilities. It's not easy to be a museum these days. There are a lot of challenges for every museum. I'm not sure we'll be able to cover it all. We're living in a time of an assault on the idea of expertise. We're living in a time of anxiety about the status of art and of art institutions. We're living in a time when we are challenged to figure out what a museum, which is an exercise devoted to objects, means in a digital, virtual age. We're living in a time when museum directors, whether they answer to ministries or philanthropists, have to think about who's going to support this ever more expensive undertaking of the museum. We are expected to do ever more, and I see there's other museum directors in the room as well. We are now providing education. We offer wonderful restaurants. We have yoga on Saturdays. We are open late. We have marvelous cocktail parties. We are global, of course. We collect everything old and new, including contemporary. We're supposed to have a digital interface. We conduct scientific things. All of this is expected, and we should be super comfortable and comply with ever-changing social norms and standards around the needs of people with physical disabilities, for example. There's always upgrades needing to happen. And that's, of course, very expensive. So all of that is in place. But perhaps the biggest change, as I would put it in this sector, is that we are moving beyond the world of the museum to the idea of a world of museums in the plural. That is to say, we've had this extraordinary globalization of museums in the last 3 decades since the Cold War. That has brought in new voices, new attitudes, new positions, new expectations, new audiences. And there is no such thing as the museum that's imposed from above, so to speak. The European museum, the American museum that's supposed to be copied around the world. Today, a museum in Dakar or Sao Paulo need not be the same as a museum in London or Paris. And that, once again, is a big adjustment, but it also opens up a space of innovation and possibility. And so we have here 2 people today who are looking at this from 2 perspectives, a kind of theoretical perspective, in your case, as a philosopher and scholar of many fields, who has been thinking about the idea of the museum, and of course a director, somebody who has to find real answers, real policies, real solutions. And I know we're going to be talking about universal museums, and I should say that whether you call them universal museums or encyclopedic museums, they too contend with all of the challenges that every other museum contends with, only with even more challenges. And they're making a journey, I would say, from being seen as an embodiment of the highest ideals of the Enlightenment to something different. To the champions of such institutions, they weave together the threads of humanity. For their most ardent detractors, they are a problematic institution. For some people, they're a crime scene. Some of the criticism have been very sharp of this institution. So here we are in this wonderful moment. New narratives are being framed. Contested objects some are being returned. I should mention today is the 7th anniversary, I think, of President Macron's new policies around contested objects. And new accommodations are being made. The Met in New York, for example, is now displaying its eclectic collection on loan back to the Met. And I think new solutions are being found to this situation. So before we get into it, I just want to say one more thing, which is this doesn't need to be a conversation about the Louvre. This is a conversation about museums in general, although obviously we'll be talking a lot about the Louvre, inevitably. And there will be some time for questions and answers. So I'd like to start by asking each of you, first Laurence, about how we bring these museums, and the Universal Museum in particular, into sort of alignment with our present moment. You have been, as we were talking the other day, and you say you came from another planet. The d'Orsay was a very different enterprise. And really from the day you started, and we have a little history because I think the week after you started, or 2 weeks after, we did a conversation in New York. But you've been very open, very transparent about the fact that change is coming and that you want to have a dialogue about the museum. So tell us, why update the museum and how?
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to Columbia, to Reid Hall for this lovely invitation and the great opportunity to have a conversation with Bachir also tonight. No, I told you that I was coming from another planet, the Musée d'Orsay. It is true. When I started, I'm relatively new in the job, only 3 years. So although it seems a century for me, but it's only 3 years, and it's not a lot for an institution like the Louvre. But Yes, I was more on the modernist side of a museum, doing a lot of exhibition, enjoying running a museum where I was in my specialty, the second half of the 19th century. But in my own story, I had a very particular moment when I was for 6 years the scientific director of the Louvre Abu Dhabi project, which probably changed my professional life because it was an extraordinary experience, and that I probably, for the first time, experienced the changes that you were mentioning. Because I was in the dossier first as a curator and then as president later. In those fields, it's a very European-centered history of art with a lot of collaboration with some American museums. And it's a very nice world to grow up in, but it's a limited world. And when Henri Loiret asked me, he was president of the Louvre at that time, to say, you have to leave Orsay and you have to see the changes of the world, the globalization of the world, because the museum world will not only be about, forever about Paris and New York. It's becoming something else. Something is happening. And I was 40 at that time, and he said to me, it's up to your generation to take your responsibility. You have to gather a team and imagine with our Emirati partners this new universal museum at the heart of the modern Arab world. Of course, I knew nothing about the Arab world. I didn't know where Abu Dhabi was at that time, and I said, no, are you absolutely sure of your choice? I am a woman, I am very French, well, I said, no, that's exactly what I mean, okay? And it'll be necessary for this generation to see that there's a whole new world and new participants demanding cultural recognition, imagining new institutions that will be part of a much more open world of museums. So it's what, in a way encouraged me when 3.5 years President Macron made me the honor of considering my name for the Louvre. And we had a long conversation about that, my international experience, this Louvre Abu Dhabi experience, and a few ideas that I had for the Louvre, seen from the other side of the Seine, about this universal question. What does it mean today when this museum is not an encyclopedic one? It's full of gaps, and maybe we'll come back to that. But this universal potential, vocation, was, I thought, a very interesting one in the very divided world that we are living in. There is something there that is interesting, that is worth of attention and probably worth reframing, reconsidering. And that's my challenge as president of the Louvre, definitely.
And just before we go on, I mean, in a way, you had more freedom in Abu Dhabi, I assume. You were inventing an institution, whereas here you're stepping into an august, hundreds of year old institution.
No, I will surprise you. No, Abu Dhabi is an extremely highly political project, highly diplomatic one. It's a state-to-state diplomatic agreement, so everything goes to the top of the state all the time. There was a lot of pressure. There were some difficult moments, some extraordinary ones. I learned a lot. And there was a lot of imagination, a lot of faith put in the project when everyone was hating the project, especially in the Louvre and in the French Museum, I have to say. So, I felt very free as president of the Musée d'Orsay. I feel very free as president of the Louvre. I might surprise you about that, but I feel very free. And if I didn't feel free, I would leave a job immediately, because it's a great responsibility, it's a great challenge, But you have to love your job, you have to love this extraordinary place, the collection, the people working within, and you have to feel free, to be free to imagine, to try, to lead, people not to be afraid of trying new ways, trying new ideas. Otherwise, it doesn't work.
And with this experience of Abu Dhabi behind you, what was the short version of your idea of the Universal Museum that as you stepped into this role at the Louvre that you brought with you with this experience?
Listen to the world as it is today. That was the big lesson. Listen to the world. See the world as it is today. Listen to other voices. And museums should be polyphonic places. They should invite different voices, different points of view. They should be places of debates, and especially when they claim to be or to present a certain narrative of a world, collection coming from different parts of the world. And that's the beauty of it. You have to listen to those different voices and points of view. It cannot be only one voice. It cannot be the curator expertise anymore. That doesn't work anymore. It doesn't mean that it doesn't count. But it's a place that needs to be challenged all the time.
And I think that the centering is the task. And we'll get back in a minute later on about what that actually means in practice. Mm-hmm. But before we go on, let's pull back. Because Bachir, obviously you've been sort of deeply enmeshed in this discourse about universalism and what that means, and now you spent, how long have you now been at the Louvre? It's been a while that you've been deeply engaged at the museum. Sorry?
Yeah, a whole year now.
Whole year. So again, you brought your perspective as a philosopher, as a thinker. First, could you give us, and we have lots of students here, I understand there's even students who are writing papers and whatnot. So give us a short précis of your understanding of the Universal Institution, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Allow me to take a few seconds to just say happy anniversary to Reid Hall and to say how happy I am myself to be back at Columbia and at the same time in Paris, which is the city that I love. I wrote an autobiography a couple of years ago when I said that my relationship to Paris would be these words: I turned 18 in Paris.
Good for you.
That says my relationship to this city. So, I came to learn about museums, and I've been learning a lot. For a year now, I think I've been interacting with the Louvre in preparation for this Chaire du Louvre and the lectures I am currently giving, and especially with Barthélemy, who is here, Lama, whom I thank deeply, and who is somehow a Columbia alum also, because
somehow, actually.
Absolutely,
right.
Absolutely. And I've been learning a lot. At first, when I was invited to give these lectures for the Chaire du Louvre, I thought I owed it to a friendship, mainly. The friendship of Donatien Gros, the friendship of Barbara Cassin, who was the holder of the chair before me. And also I had a chance to meet Laurence, thanks to Donatien, and we had started discussing also. And so I'm very grateful that this honor was bestowed to me. Now, upon me. And I thought that I would be coming from with my questions about what universalism is, because I've been working on universalism for many years. Actually, my latest book has the very title Universaliser as a verb. I'll come back to that. And I thought I will bring my philosophical questions, and question the Louvre. And what I found out very quickly is that the Louvre itself actually was raising questions about what universal means. So it was really, really a wonderful time for me to be asked to give these lectures because, as Laurence just expressed right now, I came at a time when she put forward this notion of a universal vocation. And I really recognize in that what I have been trying to think myself in my philosophical work about what I call in the concept of lateral universal, which I did not coin the expression, although some people think that I did. No, it is coming from this philosopher, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, but I somehow appropriated it because what I have in mind when I talk about a lateral universal is a universal which is not this universalism coming from above, this overarching universalism that is identified with Europeocentrism, etc., but something lateral, a lateral universal, when you have all cultures and languages in the world on the same plane, and then the only dimension that exists would be the lateral or the horizontal one. So what does it mean for these cultures, equivalent cultures, all of them having equal dignity? What does it mean for them to be in dialogue and to be projecting themselves towards a horizon of universality, as we might call it, not in spite of the diversity and the pluralism of the world, but precisely from the standpoint of the diversity and the pluralism of the world. And this is how my own questioning actually met the questioning of the Louvre and the vision of that was put forward by Laurence. Because when I think about dialogue of cultures, as I say, nobody has seen cultures in dialogue. Cultures are not in dialogue. What are in dialogue would be people or objects. When you have objects that are next to each other and that say something to each other, and when they are coming from different cultures, this is probably where the thinking should start about what it means to have a lateral universal as your horizon.
So this lateral universal, this is sort of universalism 2.0, right? You're basically saying instead of a kind of imposed and centered universalism, we can sort of recapture the idea of universalism without those power relationships.
Absolutely. Both you and Laurence pronounce the word decentering, which is very important. Decentering. We live in a decentered world anyway now, or we are going more and more towards this decentered world. The phrase provincializing Europe is now common phrase, usually used by many, and it is common sense also to say that the world is that decentered world without a center and a periphery. Mm-hmm. And this is the reason why my angle coming to the Louvre was looking at the Louvre from the standpoint of the Pavillon des Sessions, which is, as you know, hosting right now art from the Americas, pre-Columbian Americas, Oceania, Africa, and Asia. So what does it mean to read the Louvre with my question about lateral universal from that space, from that standpoint, was the question with which I approached.
And we'll get to the pavilion in a second, but I think what I want the audience also to fully understand is that this way of thinking puts you in a different corner in the debate around objects and contested objects. So could you just briefly describe that? Because for a lot of people, the only answer to the previous universalism was, we would like it back, please.
Yes, indeed. And you mentioned actually controversy. Let me say this, something personal. When it was, because my lectures have been publicized widely, on Facebook, for example, and I have received a few comments, not very friendly, but most of them were very friendly, comments from some form of very strongly decolonial standpoint, saying that, okay, why would you spend hours lecturing about this, just ask for the return of these contested objects. Period. Yeah, that is not my position, because one has to look at the trajectories of these objects first. One has to be very careful about looking at what provenance means. Understanding, for example, that the space, the colonial space, is what Homi Bhabha called also a third space. In other words, you do not have the simple situation of having the colonizer facing the colonized. The colonialism created a space of trade, of exchange, etc. So many objects actually came that way. They were bought. I'll talk tomorrow, probably. Yes, I'll talk tomorrow about...
Wait, are we meeting tomorrow here?
I'm giving a lecture tomorrow at the Louvre this time, about actually a Moai, whom I adopted as a friend. That's my friend now at the Louvre, and who was bought by the Louvre. But Moais in general are contested objects. So you have to make these kind of difference. That's one point first. The second point, more importantly, it's not doing justice to the objects that have been brought in Europe to just think that they did not have any kind of agency, that they were just prisoners or hostages waiting as long as it took to get back home. They acted, they influenced people in Europe. As the former director of UNESCO said, Amadou Mokhtar Mbow, who just passed away, they grew roots also in their soil, or in the new soil in which they were taken. And that is very important. It means that these objects have the capacity to create relationship, to create links, to create partnership. And the way in which now these contested objects are being examined calmly is going in that direction, looking at the way in which in these global museums that you mentioned in the plural, when you have more and more museums being created and developed in the South, which was not the case. I mean, I come from a country which was, whose first president was Léopold Sédar Senghor, and he believed in culture. So as early as in the 60s, he created a cultural infrastructure in Senegal, but this was not very common in Africa. Yeah. So now it is going to be more and more common. And that is something new, and that is very important. We have to think of the question of restitution, the question of these contested objects, the role they can play in creating partnerships between museums, circulating among museums, and many of them actually staying put where they are. So I hope to see the Pavillon des Sessions as it is, and where in 50 years from now.
So I think what you're describing is a new space, just as I said at the beginning, a new space of opportunity, where we can move beyond the imposed extractive universalism of the past to this ideal of this lateral universal institution, new set of arrangements. And you've just made a very eloquent case for why these objects under these circumstances should be here. So that's the theory. And now I'd like to hear the practice, which is how do you sort of re-engineer the plane in flight to make this happen? And maybe the pavillon is a good example of that.
Yeah, the pavilion is, I think, a good example. It's the first, really the first object of attention that I had when I took my position. In the summer before I took my position on September 1st, 21, and during the summer preceding this, I went to the Musée du Quai Branly to see my good friend and colleague Emmanuel Macron, who is president of the Musée du Quai Branly. And I said, Emmanuel, the Pavillon des Sessions is a beautiful place, The display designed by Jean-Michel Villeneuve is really beautiful. The objects are extraordinary. It's fascinating, but somehow it doesn't work.
So those of you who are coming
Yeah.
from the U.S., this would be like the former Rockefeller wing of the Met,
Yeah.
essentially,
Yeah.
global collections.
Yeah, it's a formal. It's a way of putting it, but still, it was imagined as a sort of embassy of the future Musée du Quai Branly, when it was still, being imagined and created, and with the old dream of many modernists, Apollinaire included, but these objects should be in the Louvre to be recognized culturally on an equal level as Greek art, as Renaissance, Italian Renaissance, or. But so the place is beautiful. It was, as you know, as many things in the Louvre, in a commission, imagined by President Chirac, who was really fond of non-Western art. And he wanted this very much to happen against one of my illustrious predecessors, Pierre Ranzambert, who happened to be the president of the Louvre at that time. And the whole thing was inaugurated almost 25 years ago. We will celebrate the 25th anniversary next year. And so I said to Emmanuel Caserero, there's something that is not working anymore in the Pavillon des Sessions because it's a very isolated place, beautiful but isolated place in the Louvre, really at the top end almost of the wing of the Louvre. It has problematic display now because it doesn't give any context of the object, any mediation for the objects. The question of a provenance are not explicit, so it creates, sometimes tensions with visitors, or at least important questions. So we should revise that. And also, I would love to have a connection with the Louvre, because for me, this is going to be permanent. I am not the president who is going to try to erase the Pavillon des Sessions. I want to revive it, because I really do believe that the universal vocation of the Louvre, as it should be imagined today, should embrace the Pavillon des Sessions, and that the Pavillon des Sessions should be almost a sort of starting point of this new vision for the Louvre. And it could be a sort of laboratory for me and the curatorial teams of the Louvre, working together for the first time with the curatorial teams of the Quai Branly, because you have to imagine that for 25 years, curators from the Louvre and the Quai Branly didn't work together. It was only the curators of the Quai Branly taking care of the objects of the Quai Branly on a Tuesday when the Louvre is closed. That's it. Which for me is a total failure as a museum project or a curatorial project. So the first time we had seminaries with the two teams working together, imagining new display with objects and works of art from the Louvre in dialogue with the works coming from Quai Branly. And so the pavilion has just been closed for renovation. The whole thing is going to be renovated. Keeping Jean-Michel Villeneuve is working on the display. And in a year time, we will integrate again, celebrating this 25th anniversary with a complete new vision. And for the first time, a dialogue between the collection of the Louvre and the Quai Branly.
What will surprise us about this new display?
But I hope it works first, because otherwise, No, I think it would be very interesting and very telling, because contrary to what a lot of people imagine, and Barthélemy knows that very well because he's supposed to work on a PhD on this question, the non-Western art collections are part of the history of the Louvre. And Pierre Singaravello, who had the Chaire of the Louvre 2 years ago, called the Chaire les fantômes du Louvre, the ghosts of the Louvre. It was all this collection that were displayed in the Louvre in the 19th century that left the Louvre in the 20th century for Guimet, for Musée de l'Homme, or and then Quai Branly, but they were part of the Louvre. This universal vocation, even in the context of the colonial empire of France, was still very much present. And I think it's very important to, and it's why I asked Pierre to work on the ghost of the Louvre, because for me, it's a whole new narrative, a much more complete one, a much more, I think, narrative that is true to the DNA of the Louvre, to what was there at the founding moment of the Louvre during the Revolution, equality of artistic expression and equality of access to those collections. And I think that it's high time for the Louvre to embrace this. So the Pavillon des Sessions new version will be a sort of first step. Then you have a second step with the creation of a new department for Byzantine art and Eastern Christianity, connected to the Roman galleries and connected to the Islamic art department. We will be completely redisplayed for this opening in 27, with complete new narratives and more to come.
And we will be there. And we will be there.
Hopefully.
Now, and by the way, I think reaching back into that institutional DNA from the founding moments is always very interesting for museums. We work on a lot of museum strategies in the US, and you actually find that many institutions which have over the years become quite formal and institutionalized, and their founding moments were super radical, and to reach back is very interesting. But I want to just come back to Bachir. You know, earlier in the conversation, Laurence said we need to listen more. It's about listening. But it's also about talking and who's doing the talking. You know, I always say that the issue of diversity and inclusion often boils down to the question of who is talking about whom. So from your perspective, how do you weave in? I mean, if this is this lateral chorus instead of some sort of imposed conversation, how can that happen? How can all these different voices inform an institution, a big major Western museum, in your opinion?
Well, first of all, the question of access that Laurence emphasized is very important. You have to be able to meet the objects in the Pavillon des Sessions when you are walking in the Louvre. Right now, I think that if you do not know that there are these objects in Pavillon des Sessions, chances are you are not going to get there. You really have to know the place in order to go there. Because one way of organizing this encounter is just moving your own sight, your own gaze, looking, you stop at one point to salute the Mona Lisa, obviously, and then you see the Samothrace, obviously, etc. And you come to also the statue dedicated to the god Gu in the Pavillon des Sessions. What does it say about not just itself or himself, but also about what you have seen already, the kind of, visual forms that you have been seeing. And hence the idea of actually when the Pavillon des Sessions reopens to match somehow pieces that are currently in the Pavillon des Sessions with other pieces. I've seen projects of having, for example, this Dieu Gu next to a Roman sculpture, etc. You are not forcing the conversation. You are just saying the possibility of the conversation. And that is how you invite the audience. You invite them to experiment with you what it means for these objects to live together. I've read a wonderful interview about the Louvre, because the Louvre published a book, just a book like your own wonderful Future of the Museum, of conversations. And I've read the conversation with, I don't remember which author now, but she mentioned, she is a she, and she mentioned a very important concept, close to what I call lateral universal, which is transtemporality. Mm-hmm. Transtemporality is precisely that, putting together objects that do not belong to the same culture, do not belong necessarily to the same time, space, and then asking yourself, what do they say to each other, and what do they say together to one who would stop by and look at them?
Yeah, go on.
No, I was going
Yeah.
to say,
Yeah.
I've seen that, for example, something like that at the Met,
Yeah.
when these African origins of civilization was put together.
Yeah.
And I think that it was a very interesting experiment. When I went to see that exhibition, I learned a lot.
And I think that this is a moment in the conversation where people might use the word agency and trusting the viewer, the visitor, to make those connections instead of saying, this is what you're seeing. Let us tell you what you're looking at. So staying a little practical for a minute. So you've already mentioned it's interesting to talk about all this now because we now have hundreds of museums all around the world which could be partners in this effort. I mean, of course, the most, seminal example being the museum that is being built for the return of the Benin bronzes, for example. As you unroll this new version of the Universal Museum, how can you collaborate with this new institutional infrastructure? What does that look like? Can you have joint appointments, joint initiatives, joint ownership? Like, what are some of the models that you're thinking about?
Collaboration is definitely at the heart of it, and the Louvre has a big tradition. I mean, the Louvre has connections with 80 countries. It's I have a diplomatic advisor in my cabinet. I'm a professional diplomat. That says it all. It's a very important international institution with an outpost in the Gulf, Louvre Abu Dhabi. Probably the only case. I mean, the Western Museum, you will have a Guggenheim Abu Dhabi in a few years, but it's a different concept. So this question of international collaboration is really at the heart of the Louvre. It means all sorts of collaborations, including emergency one. In difficult times, we are present in Iraq for the restoration of the Mosul, for instance, museum. We were in Lebanon. We were in Ukraine. We evacuated very precious works from Ukraine during the war last year. I had the honor to be in Ukraine with our former Minister of Culture to organize this emergency sauvetage, of extraordinary works, because that's the duty also of the Louvre, is to help also and to be present when things are going very wrong. But also because we have international collection. It's at the heart of excavation, the tradition of excavations. As you know, excavations are no longer sources of collection for the museum. When we are present in Egypt, for instance, it's no longer to collect objects, but to work with our Egyptian colleagues as international teams in order to just go deeper in the science of Egyptology and knowledge of this extraordinary civilization and culture. So yes, there are really a myriad of possible collaborations. The training, the exchange of curators, for instance, is another possibility. And I'm really trying to develop this because I do think that we have so much in common, Any person who's in charge of a heritage institution, of a museum, of a collection of some sort, we have so much common. Much more things in common than we have things that divide us. I do really strongly believe that because I was with the team that did Louvre Abu Dhabi. So I know that culture, art, can go where politics don't go, where ideology don't go. It works. It works because it's something that somehow is a little bit above our little egos and nationalistic problems and whatever. There's something stronger. There's something that comes from a humanity point of view. There's a certain sense of humanism, if I can try this word. And that is very strong. And it's why I am optimistic about museum. I'm one of the rare person who's optimistic about the Universal Museum.
I'll join you.
But I have to be with the job I have right now, but I do believe that it can work. And I see that, with all the conversations I have with my colleagues from all around the world, that it can work. And it's, I do believe it's the next step. It's really the next step, because we will have institutions all over the world. And that, what does it mean to be isolated when you can do so much in common? And I do believe that it's important, and that's my point of view, to have Greek art in Paris, to have French art in New York, and African art in Abu Dhabi. I do believe it's very important in the world that we are living today. It's more important than ever. Yeah. It's why also this job is, and this question of a universal museum is so important. Because it touches very, very almost existential questions right now.
Quick question. How many people have questions? It's a meta question. How many people have questions? Okay. Good. Because we're getting around to those in a minute. Well, we just had a very positive, optimistic prognosis for museums, but we are in a university facility. So as a university-based scholar, I'm just curious, having now spent a year inside a museum, are you equally optimistic for the university? And where do you see the parallels and the differences in how this whole thing is playing out in the university world, which has had its share of tensions of late?
Well, I was just quistring, as we say in French, by reminding us all that universality and university actually have the same Latin roots, and that they mean the same thing. And to comment on the rapprochement that you made. And yes, the reason why I'm optimistic is that, in a way, what a museum brings you, a museum in the sense that we have been trying to explore it, and the kind of vision that Laurence just explained about the museum. Normally, when you get out of a museum like that, when you have been spending a whole day there with all the restaurants and that you mentioned,
the yoga,
and the yoga as well, yeah, you get, I believe that you get a sense of what humanity is. In other words, that is primarily how I see it, how I see the meaning of having a museum that has this universal vocation, giving you a sense of our shared humanity. And I think that when you have a totally integrated space of the Pavillon des Sessions, a totally integrated space of the Art de l'Islam, for example, with that connection that Laurence mentioned with the Byzantine period and the Roman as well, having this sense of connection is really important, to have a sense of that shared humanity. And if we look at the museum with that idea in mind, I think one can be optimistic about what I would call a practice of universality. Just, you mentioned being practical about this concept, and understanding the concept itself as calling for a practice of universality rather than just having something called the universal. One cannot just get the universal out of their pocket, but one can believe in what it means to have together. Togetherness is very important here, is crucial actually, to have together a practice of universality, and having that visualized, translated into forms by a museum.
Okay, a couple of questions. Over here.
Unless there's a student who wants to ask the question first, but...
No, go ahead.
Okay, my name is Alessia. I also have a chance to be part of this Columbia University family for working there for many years. I have a question for both of you, actually, each of you. Thank you very much for sharing thoughts and ambition for this vision. And we would like to follow you to the end. And yet, I can't... when I went to visit Louvre Abu Dhabi, I took a taxi the taxi driver from Togo, immigrant. I asked him, did you visit the museum? He had been there for 4 years. He said, I don't have the money, I can't afford that. So, and it's not Abu Dhabi only. I think some of the question about museum opening in some African countries with this contested objects, one of the points is that who's gonna see that? In other words, the public. Where is the public in your reflection? And how do you make this lateral universality and this object that create the link able to reach out to the public when there is no cultural capital, when there is no economic capital? I mean, what is that we should do to move even forward when it comes to the public, the real public? Thank you.
Okay, let me start. Well, thank you very much. I mentioned earlier the fact that Senegal has very early invested in cultural infrastructure. When Senghor was planning to have this huge festival of black arts that he organized in 1966, this is when we first had the first museum he created in Dakar. And by the way, he called it Musée dynamique, which is very strange. In French, what does it mean to have a musée dynamique? But as a classicist, what he had in mind was the notion of dynamis, force, because his idea of African art is that African art doesn't represent reality as it is, but the foundation, the essence of reality, which is a force. But okay, this was a long digression, but let me come back to what I was trying to say. This is a way of thinking about inventing museums, reimagining museums as well. And now what is happening is that you do have a development of these infrastructures. The Museum of Black Civilizations in Dakar, I mean, people go. Last time I was there, I saw many students coming with their teachers, which is a good thing. Before the 26 artifacts that have been restituted to Benin were actually restituted, they were first allowed to Benin. And the Beninese government and the Beninese state in general was surprised by the number of people who came to see these objects. So it is the chicken-egg question. Once the offer is there, you will see that there is a demand. And anyway, you have to educate people about museum, about going to museum, etc. Just the way you have to educate them about music and so on and so forth. So that would be my answer. But you are absolutely right. It is important to make sure that people have access to museums and that they can get from it the kind of experience that I think they should be getting.
No, I was saying it's a central question. There's no museum without public. What's the point? So it is very, very important, and to make sure that everyone can have access to the museum. I cannot answer for Abu Dhabi and the ticketing policy, but nonetheless, I would mention that Louvre Abu Dhabi is a real public success. Over 1 million visitors every year, 1,200,000 visitors. I mean, this is a lot. When we were working on the project, we couldn't imagine more than 400,000 visitors a year. So, and when you see the reality of the visitors, you see a mixity and people coming from different areas of the globe, of the Middle East. It's very, very interesting. So again, we have when we lead this institution, we have to make sure this accessibility is possible. We just mentioned for the Louvre in Paris, that almost half of the visitors of the Louvre enter for free. That's a reality. And that is also an economic reality, which is not a small question in today's world. And for Louvre Lens is really a key social project, political project of Louvre, the other Louvre with Abu Dhabi, in the northern part of France, where the Galerie du Temps is free access, and where 75% of the visitors come from the Hauts-de-France, local visitors, people who will never go to Paris, probably, and never go to Paris to go to the Louvre, and never go to the Louvre, because it's not for them, socially speaking. So, yes, there's definitely a lot to do in terms of accessibility, but I think that it's always a tricky question for, especially today, because we are running institutions which are very demanding financially. You mentioned these questions, and so you need to find all the time the right balance.
Gentleman back there.
Lars Hartenstein. I was a student at Columbia many years ago. What is there to learn from the greenfield attempt to create a universal museum in Abu Dhabi for the necessarily more evolutionary journey that the Louvre Paris is on?
Not sure I understand the question, sorry.
So, Abu Dhabi was a greenfield attempt to create a universal museum from scratch in some ways. At least, maybe not.
Not
That's
exactly.
also interesting.
Not exactly.
Maybe not. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but what's to learn from that attempt for the journey that
Very
the Louvre in Paris?
very important, because what Abu Dhabi and Lens has done for the Louvre, the two other Louvre, the two kids, so is that they push the boundaries of the Louvre. No more departments in the display, direct dialogues of objects, and whole new narratives. And of course, done at a smaller scale, which is possible in Abu Dhabi, in Lens, is because you are dealing with rather small-sized museums, and it's easier to do. When you are dealing with an institution like Louvre or Met, for instance, you are working on a scale with very important collections, and you cannot experiment at the same level, of course. But the lesson, what I'm trying to do as president of Louvre, is to bring back the good lessons of Abu Dhabi and Lens to Paris now. It's one of the first things I said to the director of the 9 departments of the Louvre. I said, it's high time we brought back to Paris the lessons of Abu Dhabi and Lens, in terms of display, of narratives, of imagination, and to the connection with the audience, to the visitors, listening to the visitors, giving more information and more freedom also of interpretation of the objects and of the collections. And I think that step by step, we are making progress. There's a lot to do, of course, but I think it's starting, to be heard internally at the Louvre.
One more back there.
So in the news this week, I'm specifically referring to the New York Times, only because that's the only newspaper I read. But there's been the art piece titled "Comedian" by the Italian artist, I believe he's Italian, Catalan.
Maurizio Catalan.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with this piece, it's like a literal banana taped to a wall with duct tape, and it's not like, it's not the first time he has produced this piece. So it's, it's a reproduced piece that's been in various different art exhibitions. And it's, the artist himself kind of says it's, he's kind of making a mockery of what is considered art and what people commodify and consume. So I'm just kind of curious, would this kind of art, or how does this kind of fit within the Louvre or any kind of quote, institutions of art? So I'm what is your opinion of, would this kind of art ever be in the Louvre or not? like a kind of like ephemeral art.
And
It
will
was.
be
It was. Mauricio Catalan. You should check the Louvre little story of exhibition. Mauricio Catalan was invited by the Louvre, by Henri Loiret, and he did a few interventions in the Louvre very brilliantly. He's a very brilliant artist. Well, an extraordinary sense of irony and extremely, it targets the right weakness every time. So, and I tried to reopen the Louvre to living artists because this is also a house, it had also been open for artists at the very beginning of its story. And I think it's very important. And we are very fortunate to welcome in residency right now Kader Hatia and Elizabeth Payton, for instance. I recreated artist studio within the Louvre. And they are both working in the Louvre right now in their studios. I think it's very, very important. That's another debate, but for me, there's no separation between ancient art, modern art, and living and all contemporary creation. I think it's a continuum. And one of the freedom that the Louvre gives you in its potential universality is that you learn that there's no boundary. And the more you push the boundary, the more it works. That's the beauty of it.
So actually that topic of contemporary art in the Encyclopedic Museum is just one of many that we touched on. And I think we knew that this short hour will not be enough to be panoramic about our issue, but we did talk about really a lot about the sort of new ideas of universalism. We talked about listening, we letting others speak too. We talked about reformatting collections, collaborations. We talked about the money side. We talked about the idea of expertise and where that's coming from and what kind of collaborations can help in this reinvention. And over again, reminding that there's a great, perhaps surprising amount of freedom and possibility and space to rethink these institutions. I'd like to close on one last question. By the way, it doesn't seem like the $6.7 million banana is coming to the Louvre. Maurizio Catalan is coming to the Louvre. But I think along with this sort of surprising sense of flexibility, because these institutions can be changed, there is a question that I want to close on, which is what I call the perception gap, which is that I think today's conversation was very similar to conversations I have every week inside museums, where people are profoundly interested in different perspectives, different art. Kader Hatia, that is a very critical voice to bring into a place like the Louvre. It's a very bold thing to do. And museums are really working very hard to open up, to be more democratic, more accessible, physically, in terms of who gets to work there, who's invited there, who you let in for free, how you add another entrance, all those things that are happening in the world of museums. However, that is not necessarily the perception that the society has. That is to say, I'm not sure society has caught up with this new reality. That there's a gentleman like you working in the Louvre to help think about these issues. And so my closing question to each of you is how can we close that perception gap? What can museums do to project and to make people understand that they're a different museum than what many of us sort of grew up with? What should they be doing more of? Who'd like to? You go first.
Work harder, maybe.
Work harder, come on. Bartholomew, work harder, please. Yeah.
Education is the key notion here. I mean, that is how you change perception. Education. Again, I don't want to seem like I'm always quoting Latin, but going back to the etymology of education, getting you out of your certainties and your prejudices and etc. is its function, just decentering you. And I think that the function and the mission of decentering is crucial.
Well, with that, thank you very much for this brief window into this topic. Thank you all for coming.